The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. And we say hello to David Cooper, Senior Economic Analyst with the Economic Policy Institute. David, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
And nice to have you with us. Your organization has done remarkable work advocating for the $15 minimum wage. Part of that is to document the widespread benefits if this were to happen. First of all, how many people would see a bigger paycheck?
Yeah, if we were to raise the federal minimum wage to $15 by 2025, which is the schedule that's been proposed, we estimate that 32 million workers throughout the country would get a raise. That's a little more than 1 out of every 5 wage earners in the country. And just to clarify a little bit, we estimate that about 22 million of those workers are folks that would otherwise be paid less than $15, so they're directly going to get a raise. And then there's about another 10 million workers who are folks who would probably be earning just above $15 in 2025 anyway, and they're likely to get a raise as well as employers adjust their overall pay scales to leave some distance between folks who have been there for a while and folks who are new on the job. So in total, 32 million workers, about a fifth of the workforce.
And by your estimation, how will this change the numbers of people who now live below the poverty line?
Well, it's gonna lift a lot of folks out of poverty. We ran the numbers and we find that there's about 6 million workers who are currently in poverty that would get a raise from this bill. So that's about 60% of all the working poor, all those that are employed that are currently in poverty would get a raise from this bill. It may not lift all of them above the poverty line, but it's going to help a lot. Other studies that have looked at this have put the number at somewhere between 1 and 2 million that would be lifted above the poverty line. So a really substantial chunk of folks that would be lifted above the poverty line because of this.
And it's certainly a great place to start. I mean, it may not achieve everybody or everything that we want, but it's certainly some place to start, and it's long overdue, of course. At the individual level, what would an increase from today's minimum wage to $15 actually make a difference on a worker's life?
Yeah, I mean, it would have a substantial difference. It would make a substantial difference for a lot of folks. And again, I'll put some numbers on this. We estimate that raising the minimum wage to $15 would send an additional $107 billion to low-wage workers, into low-wage workers' paychecks each year after the bill was fully enacted. So for an individual worker, the average affected worker would see their total annual income go up by about $3,300 a year. Now that may not seem like a huge amount, but for someone who's only making, $25,000 a year, an extra $3,300 could go a long way. I mean, that's a significant increase in their spending.
Before we started the interview, a couple of us were talking and looking at the different states around the country and where their minimum wages are. And it's just sort of mind-boggling when you look at all the different states that are sitting way down here in the basement and just thinking, well, gosh, I mean, this is just a horrible way to live. And I thought, even if they got $1, so if you go from $7.25 to $8.25, you're going to be gleeful. You're going to be so happy. And yet you're still way down the ladder of where we should be. It's astounding that more people aren't on board for making this happen and making it happen fast.
Yeah, And the truth is, there's a lot of folks. I mean, we need $15 right now, frankly. I mean, there's a lot of folks. We have a tool on our website called the Family Budget Calculator that allows you to look at how much it costs to have what we would describe as a modest but adequate standard of living anywhere in the country. You can enter your zip code and it'll give you the numbers. And we find in that tool, the data show that there's not a single place in the country where a single person can achieve that standard of a modest but adequate standard of living without $15 today. So, unfortunately, we could use $15 today. We're talking about raising it to $15 5 years from now because you have to give some time to make those changes to allow businesses to adjust. But getting to 15 in 5 years, it would be a huge improvement for a lot of these folks, as you noted. But you make a good point that even that is not going to be enough in a lot of places.
Mm-hmm. Your organization also has data on how raising the minimum could reduce growing income inequality along racial and gender pay gaps. Why is that the case?
Well, it's the case because typically women and workers of color are disproportionately represented among low-wage jobs. This is the result of, decades, if not centuries, of historical discrimination, what economists sometimes call occupational segregation, just sort of only allowing these disadvantaged groups to go into certain professions that have been underpaid due to racism and sexism for many years. And so as a result of that, when you raise the minimum wage, you're going to shift more income, you're going to raise wages more for a lot of women and workers of color who have been disadvantaged for so long. So when we look at the numbers of the 32 million workers that would benefit from a higher minimum wage, women are the majority. It's 59%, so just less than 60% of all the workers that would benefit are women. Workers of color would disproportionately benefit. So of all Black workers, about a third would get a raise as a result of this bill. About a quarter of all Hispanic workers would get a raise as a result of this bill. More than a third of all Black women workers would get a raise as a result of this bill. So, these are measures that are going to lift up these particular groups of folks more than anyone else, mainly because workers of color and women have been disproportionately represented in these low-wage jobs for so long.
Absolutely. And much long, as you pointed out at the beginning of that answer, much longer than we would really care to think. We're speaking with David Cooper, Senior Economic Analyst with the Economic Policy Institute. And David, as we were recently reminded, of course, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, is doing its own analysis of the impact of raising the wage. Their latest report contained some points of agreement with the Economic Policy Institute. In what ways does that report support your findings?
Yeah, so, CBO's report, in their analysis, they agree with us that raising the minimum wage would lift wages for millions of workers. By CBO's estimation, they put the number at 27 million workers, so a little bit lower than us. But they estimate that this is a policy that would raise wages for a huge chunk of the workforce. They also they also say that raise the minimum wage would lift about 1 million workers above the poverty line, so they agree with us there. They also note that doing this would provide governmental savings in programs like the Supplemental Nutrition Program, the SNAP program, food stamps, the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Tax Credit, these public assistance programs that a lot of low-wage workers are forced to rely on because they don't make enough on the job. It's gonna lift some folks up, allow for them to not have to rely on those programs as much. That's gonna generate some savings of government programs. CBO notes that as well. And so, I think that CBO's report really bolsters the case that this is a policy that would be beneficial. The other thing that's interesting in that CBO report that just came out is they also note, and we have stated this, that raising the minimum wage is a good tool to fight inequality. I mean, they note that a lot of the financing of these higher wages would come from folks at the top having to pay a little more in terms of prices, and businesses who have been making record profits in a lot of cases having to shift some of those profits into wages for workers. So really interesting finding there, CBO being explicit that the minimum wage is a tool to fight inequality.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Well, I mean, the wage gap that has grown, in the last 50 years is, I mean, I don't understand why a CEO needs 20 million and 10 million is not enough. I mean, that's just it's kind of crazy to me that that's the case, but that seems to be what it is. Now, of course, on the other side of things, there were some key differences between the CBO report and the analysis provided by the Economic Policy Institute. How significant are these differences?
Well, so the primary difference in CBO's estimation with ours and frankly with a lot of folks is that CBO takes a much more pessimistic view of the likely job effects of a higher minimum wage. And this is the question that's always raised, that opponents of higher minimum wages always float, that somehow when you raise the minimum wage, it's going to cause massive job loss. And this is a topic that has been studied just enormously in the economics literature. And most of the more recent literature tends to show that higher minimum wages tend to do exactly what they're supposed to do. They raise wages for low-wage workers with little, if any, impact on jobs. But for some reason, CBO has decided that they've actually changed their jobs impacts to be even more negative than they were before. For some reason, between 2019, when CBO last studied this, and today, CBO has decided that that raising the minimum wage would lead to more significant job loss than they estimated previously. We don't really know why they made that choice, given the fact that there's been even more research that's come out over the last 2 years, which has again indicated that higher minimum wages tend to have little, if any, impact on jobs. So we disagree significantly with them there. But again, what's interesting is that even if you take CBO's report at face value, the overwhelming conclusion is that this is a policy that's going to do a lot more good than any potential harms. Particularly, if you tend to discredit or think that their jobs impact estimations are wrong, as we do.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's something that I didn't understand about that CBO report. Look, when you're paying people more money, they have more money to spend, and so the cycle
Right.
continues, and it just and when they're spending more money, a business can hire more people to do jobs. So that I've never understood that argument, and I still don't get it, and I certainly disagree with it. The fight in Congress to raise the minimum wage is obviously a work in progress. Who are your key allies, and are you hopeful actual progress can be made?
Well, there are a lot of folks who are working on this, and really the people that should be given the most credit are workers themselves, who have been out on the front lines, going on strike, calling for higher wages. Obviously, the Fight for 15 has just been instrumental in changing people's attitudes around the minimum wage. I mean, I remember back, I think it was 2010, when workers first walked off the job in New York City to call for a $15 minimum wage, and folks looked at them as if they were crazy. And now today, $15 is the standard that lawmakers, policymakers are calling for, advocates are calling for, and so there's a large coalition of folks that are fighting for this at this point. How hopeful am I? I'd say I'm more hopeful today than I've been in a long time. The fact that the president has taken this up as something that he cares about and a policy that he wants to see changed, and congressional Democrats passed a $15 minimum wage bill in the House last summer. Obviously, it didn't go anywhere in the Senate, and it's unclear how things are going to play out this time around. But the fact that we are hearing it talked about a lot at the highest levels of government is certainly encouraging. And not only that, the fact that you've had states, the most recent one being Florida in this last election cycle, where the voters themselves, 60% of the voters in Florida elected to raise the state minimum wage to $15. And this was in a state that went for Donald Trump. So that tells me that there is enormous appetite for higher minimum wages among the voting public. And it's really just a question as to whether congressional Republicans are going to get out of the way and start to respond to the will of the voters.
And, you mentioned 2010, and if I'm not mistaken, that was the last time there was a federal raise, and it's been up to states and since then to raise the minimum wage.
2009, actually, even longer than that.
Even worse than I thought. And in fact, in the last 30 years, I think there have been two stretches of a decade or more where there's been no movement. And I think, if you just do it incrementally, a little bit at a time, this doesn't hurt anybody. It only helps people.
Well, that's absolutely right. This is actually the longest time we've gone without an increase in the federal minimum wage. The previous record was in the 80s. And one good thing that's great about the bill that's being proposed in Congress right now is that it would fix this problem. What it would do is once it gets to 15, it would do something called indexing, which would automatically adjust the federal minimum wage every year thereafter based upon growth in wages for the workforce as a whole. So we wouldn't have to deal with this problem again. The minimum wage would just be automatically adjusted every year to make sure that low-wage workers aren't falling behind everyone else. And this is actually what happens in a lot of states. I think there's 19 states now that have some form of this indexing where there's an automatic adjustment in the minimum wage every year. I mean, this is something where we could just fix it and then we could forget about it and wouldn't have to worry about it anymore. And it's just a question as to whether Congress is going to take action.
We can remain hopeful. I guess that's pretty much all we can do at this point. David Cooper, Senior Economic Analyst with the Economic Policy Institute, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. David, appreciate your time with us today and would love to have you back again soon.
Sure, my pleasure. Anytime.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Republican politicos are all over Joe Biden for failing to stop inflation. Perhaps you wonder, though, what these squawkers would do if they were in charge. No need to wonder. Just look back to 1974, when Americans were being pummeled by price spikes that topped 12%, nearly double what we're enduring today. But by gollies, President Gerald Ford and his Republican contingent in Congress met the challenge head-on with a new magical program of economic uplift they called WIN, Whip Inflation Now. But it was nothing, just a political slogan with no magic and no action behind it. Price controls, antitrust action? No. GOP Inc. didn't want to offend, much less punish, corporate titans for a little profiteering. So they shifted the blame for inflation to consumers, demanding that families just say no to price gouging. Ford himself went on national TV, urging fellow citizens to join him in buying, quote, only those products and services priced at or below present levels. The core of the Republican program, then, was telling hard-hit wage earners to battle the monopolistic behemoths of big oil, big pharma, big food et al. On their own by simply refusing to pay inflated prices for the gasoline, medicines, groceries, and such that, they had to have. As a reward, everyone who signed a form promising to be an inflation fighter was sent a nifty win button, indicating their patriotic participation. Sure enough, Americans responded enthusiastically with an avalanche of ridicule. Even Ford's top economic advisor was whopper-jawed by the GOP's idea that the substance of their policy was a political button. It was surreal. I said to myself, this is unbelievable stupidity.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. And we say hello to Janelle Jones, the Managing Director for Policy and Research at Groundwork Collaborative. She recently co-authored with Jared Bernstein The Impact of the COVID-19 Recession on the Jobs and Incomes of Persons of Color. Janelle Jones, thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome back to the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be back and talk about, some of the really pressing, important issues of our day.
And that may even be an understatement as far as where we are today in our world. When we talk about the disproportionate impact of coronavirus on people of color in the United States, it's often in terms of health disparities. But this impact also carries into economics. What are some of the key markers of this disparate economic impact?
Yeah, you're right. We have seen the virus really show, some of the underlying structural disparities that have been with us, for a generation. And I think the virus has really brought some of those to light and made them even harder to ignore. So something that we've been tracking closely at Groundwork is definitely unemployment. And Jared and I talk a lot about this in the paper. We've actually seen the unemployment gap between people of color and whites actually increase during the so-called recovery over the last 6 months. This is something that, we really have to pay attention to, because we saw in the last recovery that, we were declaring, the longest expansion in our history, but Black workers were still not fully recovered from the Great Recession. And so I think unemployment rates is one. We've seen huge disparities in folks who are able to work from home. So workers of color are much less likely to be able to do their jobs at home. We've seen that workers of color are, disproportionately part of essential workers. So they're going to work, they're choosing between, a paycheck and really the safety and health of their lives and their loved ones. We're seeing differences in wages, we're seeing differences in healthcare coverage, really all of the disparities we can think about that have economic impacts. We are seeing that those are workers of color are really bearing the brunt.
Yeah. In trying to understand why these economic disparities are happening, some of this has to do with so-called pre-existing conditions, if you will. Mm-hmm. What aspects of the U.S. economy were already in place before the pandemic that make people of color even more vulnerable to its economic impact?
Yeah, that's a great question. I really have been describing COVID as the spark that really, lit something that is we've had some kindling for quite a long time. And I think there's really, a handful of factors. One is extreme inequality. Everyday workers and families were already struggling before March of this year. And we saw, we can go to a newspaper in the past year and see the way that the top 1% are really just amassing wealth and power at a truly astonishing speed, while working people wages are stagnant and they have, they're struggling to cover healthcare and housing and debt. So extreme inequality is definitely one. I think a second factor that's made this much worse is the erosion of worker power. So we've seen conservative policies kind of erode collective bargaining rights over the past generation at the state and federal level. And that has meant that, at a time when workers are really facing a bunch of slack in the labor market, they were already in a weak position because of the erosion of worker power. So I think that that's a second. A third and a fourth really tied to, are so much tied to this moment, and that's kind of austerity budgets and deregulation. we've already seen some talk of like, there's not enough money left, or, like the scarcity model that says that, we've already spent too much, we can't spend enough. We are in a recession and economic downturn that is so deep, that was so swift. The idea that we cannot keep giving people the help that they need is just, it's a disgrace, and it's sad, and it's troubling, and it's also just not true. So I think the turn to austerity is one, deregulation is another. And then the fifth is, something that we talked about a little bit, is just deep systemic racism. We have an economy that for workers, particularly Black workers, has not been working. And this recession has shown just how true that is.
And, when talking about getting people back on their financial feet and that sort of thing, and we don't have enough money to do it, it's not giving people money. It's investing in them so that they can live, so that they can continue to work, and that they can continue to live a somewhat normal life. Right. So it makes it even more piggish to me that we're not doing more for everybody, but especially people of color.
Yeah, I think you're right. At Groundwork, we have this shorthand, we are the economy. And what that means is, we, the people who make up most of what the economy is, like, we are the economy, and the economy is not doing well if we are not doing well. Every time I see those headlines where it's like the Dow Jones had its best day, 40 million people unemployed, it's like, what are we talking about here? Like, it boggles the mind the way that we would recognize the stock market as the economy when millions of Americans are out of work, millions are sick, tens of thousands are dying. The economy is not working. If it is not working for most people, if it is not working for people of color, if it is not working for marginalized communities, then it's just not working. And I think this conversation that we had maybe at the beginning of the summer, which was, it was really trying to divorce like the health of people from whether or not the economy is working. And it's like, I hope the lesson that we have learned is we cannot have a healthy economy without healthy people to populate it. It doesn't make any sense. So yeah, I think it's so troubling and so stark. And I think, yeah, we have to help people. Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you there.
Oh no, I just think that, people deserve economic security, dignity. And, even if your end goal is just like to fuel capitalism, you still want healthy people. You still want to let them have money to spend in the economy. So it's just, yeah, austerity is just not the way for so many reasons.
And the stock market does not represent the entire economy of this country. When you think about all the people that, like the person that has 3 different jobs, part-time jobs, 401k, please. I mean, right. That's crazy.
My boss likes to say that the stock market is a mood ring for rich people. And I think that is true, right? Like, the working people in my family, their lives are not changed by the ups and downs of the stock market, but they are changed by an economic downturn that affects millions of Americans. And so I think we just have to start using a different measure of what is the economy and what is economic success.
Well, and in your work on this issue, you turn to other downturns in the economy and how the impact varied by race and ethnicity. And you touched a little bit on that a moment ago. While you see the same pattern in this recession as others before it, you also predict the largest Black-white employment gap on record. It may seem obvious, but what makes this time different?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. One is really the severity and swiftness of this recession is just, it's something we haven't seen. It's something so many of us have never seen. And so I think the way that this recession has really come on so quickly and really, forced businesses to close, I think is really important. I think the health packs that we touched on, if we have Black and brown workers more likely to be infected, more likely to die from the disease, I think, all of that has an economic impact. If Black and brown workers are more likely to be essential workers, to be frontline workers, I think that also has an impact. But I think the numbers that we've seen over the past couple of months for unemployment rate is really, showing this bear out. Like we've already seen that unemployment rate for certain groups of people of color is actually, it's increasing. It's not decreasing. It's not even stagnant. It's actually ticking up while the unemployment rate for white workers decreases. And something, the mistake I think we made at the end of the last recession is we pulled our foot from the gas too soon. While millions and millions and millions of Black and brown workers and families and communities were still struggling, we decided to pull back on actually giving aid. And I think like to think that we have already kind of decided that we are done giving aid until after the election is just, I mean, it's a disgrace. It's awful. And I think the folks usually hurt by that most often are people of color.
Yeah, and when that came out, it was just one of these things where you've got to be kidding me. And I didn't think there would be any more surprises after 3+ years of this administration. But to come out and announce that we're not going to give anybody any money until after the election, look around what's going on in this country and around the world for that matter.
Exactly. I mean, there's a healthcare crisis, there's food insecurity, people have credit cards and debt, rent is still due. It's just, what are people doing with childcare and elder care? I mean, it's just the idea that a global pandemic is happening, that we are in an economic downturn, and we have decided, we have made the choice to not help millions of Americans when we very well could is just, I'm at a loss of words, truly.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, it's important to look at these disparities, not just in terms of numbers, in terms of quality of life. How do you see this recession making an impact on people of color?
I think it's going to be terrible. It's going to be as awful as something we could imagine, in part because we are not giving people the help that they need up front. But, what we've seen, particularly in terms of the health packs, like, for folks who are not, who don't die after they get COVID, we've seen long lasting health impacts already. Like we've seen that just because you test negative for the virus after testing positive does not mean your interaction with this virus is over. And I think that has a long lasting impact. Ripping folks out of the labor market for months at a time takes a hit on wealth, on savings, on their ability to earn weekly income. There's a bunch of really good work on the impacts of children whose parents suffer long-term unemployment and what that does for them in their future earnings and education. The numbers this past month showed that long-term unemployment is increasing. We've seen that a tight labor market really does bring folks from off the sidelines, but often, the long-term unemployed are really last to get that benefit. And so we're going to see, records amounts of long-term unemployment. Of the jobs that we've lost since February, we've only gained back about half. So 10 million workers are still, I mean, like so much of this story just actually leaves me speechless. Permanent job losses are continuing to pile up. They increased to about 4 million workers in September. And this is, all of this is a choice. All of this are choices that we are making to not give economic security and stability to millions of Americans.
Yeah. We're speaking with Janelle Jones, Managing Director for Policy and Research at Groundwork Collaborative, recently co-authored with Jared Bernstein, The Impact of the COVID-19 Recession on the Jobs and Incomes of Persons of Color. And Janelle, when and if there is a recovery in our future, and obviously we all hope that's sooner rather than later, your work indicates that people of color do less well than whites during recovery periods. You've kind of touched on this, but help us understand that a little bit better.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a really, really good point to highlight right now as we think about what is a recovery. I think at the beginning, we really can, make some choices about what does it mean for success? What does it mean when we recovered? Some work that I've done at Economic Policy Institute and that Valerie Wilson has done has shown that housing wealth for Black Americans actually never recovered from the Great Recession. So while we're seeing headlines about the longest expansion in U.S. history, Black workers, Black families had not recovered. Their wages had not recovered. We saw labor force participation rates still very, very low. And so I think what it means is, I love to ask recovery for who? When we talk about like, oh, things are getting better, we're seeing improvements, for who? The work that I've done with Jared Bernstein about monetary policy, I think is a really good way to think about it. The Federal Reserve has a dual mandate to keep stable prices and to reach full employment. By the Federal Reserve's own definition, Black workers have actually never experienced full employment. Never. So I just think that now is a really important time to think about what are the metrics of success? How are we measuring recovery? If we mean recovery and the only groups of folks who are doing well is white workers, I don't consider that a success. I don't think our job is done. I think we should still be, putting in policies and implementing things to help workers of color. And I think that we've made this mistake in the past. We have declared recovery while millions and millions and millions of Black and brown workers were still suffering in economic crisis conditions. And so I just think that, we've made this mistake before, and we can make a different choice now. It really, truly is just a set of choices that we can make differently.
Mm-hmm. Let's turn to policy. The paper you co-wrote is a call to get ahead of the curve. And you speak of cyclical and structural measures. What's the difference between the two?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think some of the structural issues that I mentioned earlier, the systemic racism, the increasing inequality, these are things that are embedded in the way that we have designed the economy that we can change. But we need work. We need a lot of work, a lot of time, a lot of effort to figure those things out. The cyclical really just moves up and down with the business cycle, right? Like, so sometimes, a financial crisis can be cyclical. I think at the beginning, we honestly thought a global pandemic would be cyclical because we would, figure out how to solve it and we moved on. I just remember in March, like, saying the sentence, "When this is all over," and like how naive we all were then.
Well, now wait, we didn't have to be. We didn't have to be.
This bad. It did not have to be this bad.
Yeah.
Is something I say out loud quite often.
Yeah.
And so, right, those are the things that really just, the boom and bust of the economy because of how it's designed. But these structural issues are things that really take bold transformational change. The erosion of worker power, that is something that we can rectify that could take a long-term change. I mean, you can also, unionize everything. We could do that. But that is something, I think there's been a trend of kind of conservative policies that have really attacked progressive ideas for the economy. And those things tend to be structural and take bigger, bolder ideas for change.
What are some of the key measures you want policymakers to be thinking about in terms of both cyclical and structural measures?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, broadly, I really want policymakers to think about racial gaps. I really want them to think about who is impacted by a policy and how do we know it's working? Like, what is the group that needs to experience better outcomes for it to be declared a success? I think that's like the broad overarching way of the way I think about policy. And then, in terms of specifics, we actually saw some good policy response at the beginning of this. We saw the CARES Act, we saw, stimulus checks, we saw $600 boost of UI, like those were good things. And I think the numbers are showing us now that those things helped. Those things helped the economy. There was research earlier this year that showed that, the poverty rate went down a little bit at the beginning of this because of the way we boosted support to families. So I think, those are some of the specifics. I mean, the idea that healthcare is tied to employment right now, like, I just don't know why it was ever, but it just seems like such a mistake right now. Josh Bivens has done a bunch of work at EPI. And I think the most recent update is, 15, 17 million Americans have lost health insurance because they've lost their jobs because businesses have shut down. So I think, healthcare, I would love to bring back the expansion of UI. But we can also, we lost a ton of government jobs, and that is a real choice. We can give monies to cities and states to make sure they don't face budget shortfalls that force them to cut essential services. I mean, what are we going to do about care work? What are we going to do about care work? Care work is the work that makes everything else possible. And so, during this time when we really have to stay home, we have to stay home to get a handle on the crisis. I think we just need to give families the support they need to make it through and make ends meet.
And, you're right. And about the CARES Act, absolutely. It was necessary and it was helpful, and it's exactly what we needed. Mm-hmm. But now that we've gone this far along with this pandemic because we ignored everything else, to me, it's the equivalent of the president throwing rolls of paper towels out to a group of people in Puerto Rico after their island has been completely decimated by a hurricane.
Exactly.
It's just, in the end, in the longer term, it really hasn't done anything at all because now we're right back where we were economically.
Well, it's honestly made things worse. Like, if we had just done what we needed to do, we could be on the other side in actual recovery, but we have just dug ourselves into a deeper hole, right? We've seen, families are falling even further behind on rent. Families are falling, families are decimating their savings even more. Long-term employment is increasing even more. Like, we've just we've just made things, I don't think we are back to where we started. I think we've actually made things worse by this inaction. And that means we just have to do even more to get ourselves out of this bigger hole.
Yeah. Before we let you go, as you look at how we are responding to this crisis, or not responding to this crisis, I guess, and in your conversations with policymakers, is it your sense there is a willingness to take on this challenge?
I think that there is. I truly think that there is. And I think we've seen Democrats in Congress working hard to try to get relief to people. And what they have been met with from congressional Republicans and the Trump administration is just, it's a disgrace. It's an actual national disgrace. And so, I think folks are trying. I saw Powell had some comments yesterday about the need to pair fiscal response with a monetary response. And he's trying, he is doing whatever he can at the Federal Reserve, but that it won't be enough unless we actually get aid to folks. We have to give aid to folks. And I think the news yesterday about Trump pulling negotiations is just, it's what we see. We see Democrats trying to make sure people can pay their rent, not be evicted, get some healthcare coverage, maybe get some care help. And congressional Republicans are saying no. They're saying, figure it out. You're on your own. Don't let the virus dominate you. And that's what we've seen. So I think some people are willing, we've seen plans. We've seen a ton of good legislation come out of the House. We've seen people talk in public about the things they would want to do if they could get some help to get some laws passed.
Pretty appalling.
Yeah.
Pretty appalling. Janelle Jones, Managing Director for Policy and Research at Groundwork Collaborative, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Again, recently co-authored this paper with Jared Bernstein titled The Impact of the COVID-19 Recession on the Jobs and Incomes of Persons of Color. Janelle, as always, we appreciate you joining us today. Would love to have you back again soon.
Thanks so much. This was a great conversation. I'm happy to have it.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Chris Christie, Rudy Giuliani, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, they're just some of the ones you talk about. Where were these guys when God was giving out backbone?
I think they were raising money for their re-elections or their elections. I don't know, man. Yeah. It's dispiriting, but my point here is that Donald Trump did not have to happen. I wanted to focus on the people who were complicit in the Republican Party and just sort of rolling over for him. And yeah, there's a pretty big and illustrious cast of characters here.
Well, of many takeaways, Mark, I enjoyed the book immensely, by the way.
Thank you.
I think that was your main takeaway, that it's not so much Donald Trump, it's the acolytes who made him happen and who keep him happening. Right?
Yes. That is, you have, as far as I'm concerned, you have identified the correct takeaway, Bill. It's look, Donald Trump is, I think, culpable enough for a lot of reasons, but I did not want to write a book that focused, on Trump. I didn't, I think there's been plenty out there about the Trump White House and all the outrages that went on. And I wasn't trying to find the killer anecdote where, there he is feeding dog food to Mike Pence in the Oval Office. And, oh, wow, can you believe that scoop? No, I think the story of Washington, by and large, from the last 6-7 years, has been the absolute dereliction of the Republican Party in stopping this. And, the Mitch McConnell, Paul Ryan, Kevin McCarthy, they all got something out of the deal. They got their judges, they got their tax cut, they got to keep their jobs if they stayed on the right side of dear leader, and they did for the most part. Mm-hmm. They made it work for themselves, which is not a new Washington story. But to me, it was like this rollicking kind of Sodom and Gomorrah of Washington, sort of set at the Trump Hotel, and we lived through it as people who operate and live in Washington, and it's been unlike anything I've ever seen, and it was not always pleasant, and so here we are. But I wanted to tell the story of that Washington, again, focusing on the enablers, the ones who just allowed it to happen.
Right. Well, the one phrase that one of many that's stuck with me from the book is, I think this was originally said about Mike Pompeo, a heat-seeking missile for Trump's ass.
Yes.
Now, this is a tough question, Mark, but of the list that I originally read, Lindsey Graham, Kevin McCarthy, Pompeo, Chris Christopher, who is the worst of the heat-seeking missiles, or the worst of the ass-kissers, do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I guess by way of, first of all, I'm going to back up. I mean, Susan Glasser of The New Yorker is the originator of the quote from, I think, a State Department spokesperson who's described Mike Pompeo as a heat-seeking missile for Trump's ass. And, my feeling is, full credit to Susan for getting the quote, but my feeling is that quote can never be uttered enough. So, there were a whole party full of heat-seeking missiles for Trump's ass, and unfortunately, I can't get that image out of my mind. But he, but that, it's a kind of a colorful quote. But it has been like the operating sort of principle of the Republican Party. I mean, humoring Donald Trump has been it's been the race to do that. So you ask, who is worse? Who is the worst heat seeker? The heat-seeking head of states. I would say probably Kevin McCarthy. I would put him in a special category because he works so hard at it, but also he is so powerful. He's the head of the Republican caucus, and he will probably be Speaker of the House. So that gives him kind of a alpha lapdog status.
You actually referred to him as a diamond-level ass-kisser.
Yes, I did. I mean, the thing about writing a book as opposed to writing for the New York Times is, you can actually get away with some more colorful synonyms for, like, sycophant or something clinical like that. But, one of the reasons I left the New York Times to go to the Atlantic is, you can use profanity. But, it was a real challenge after a while to find proper ways of saying this. And by the way, another credit is to my favorite was the Brigade of Turd Polishers. Pretty good. Charlie Sykes of the Bulwark came up with that one. But no, McCarthy really worked at it. He's powerful, and so I would give him first among equal status among the ass kickers.
For those of our listeners who have not yet read the book, but we will put a link up so that all of our listeners can buy the book and read it and enjoy it as much as I did. Tell us about McCarthy. Maybe this is the one story that illustrates most how far he was willing to go. Tell us about the starbursts.
Yeah, this has sort of become a legend in the annals of Washington suck-uppery. Early on in Trump's term, McCarthy got on Air Force One, like, people do. It's like they love riding an Air Force One with the president. And McCarthy noticed that Trump was eating Starburst, the pleasing fruit candy, and he only liked the pink ones and the red ones. He would discard the yellow ones and the orange ones. As a personal aside, I personally love the orange and the yellow ones and prefer them to the red ones, but no one really cares about my tastes here. But so McCarthy took note of this, and being the, attention to detail, diamond level ass kisser that he is, he arranged to have a whole gift basket or gift jar of Starburst sent over to the White House with the yellows and the oranges already removed. I don't know who the staff person who did that is, or if that person is actually on the taxpayers' dime.
Probably.
Yeah, good use of your tax dollars. So he had the reds and the pinks sent over, and the president was apparently very moved by the gesture, loved the attention to detail, and that became a real calling card in what Kevin McCarthy was willing to do to ingratiate himself to Donald Trump.
My Kevin, right?
Kevin. Yeah, a term of ownership as much as of affection.
But particularly a chicken shit when right on January 6th, for example, McCarthy was one of the first ones to go out and say, the president's responsible. And then those tapes came out, which of course he denied ever saying, but we had tapes of his voice saying, I called him and I told him, and you got to stop this. You got to do something. And he told his members, we have to make sure he's held accountable. And then he goes down to Mar-a-Lago again.
8 days after Trump left Washington, McCarthy, went and followed him like a heat-seeking missile for his ass. For some reason, thought that it wasn't going to get out. But of course, Trump had already alerted the press. There were helicopters sort of flying above them. And there's this picture of them all over social media, and they're both kind of sucking in their stomachs, and they're in like a wax museum room. I don't know.
Yeah.
In Mar-a-Lago. So I know you've probably spent a great deal.
Not invited, Mark.
Not invited. Yeah, me neither. But then he came back and was like, "What?" And people were like, "What the hell?" And like Liz Cheney was irate, and he said, "Oh, I was just in the neighborhood," which I thought was an incredibly funny answer. It's like, yeah, I mean, wow, hey, I'm like a few miles from Mar-a-Lago. Maybe I'll go stop in. And imagine him stopping at like an edible arrangements on the way over to get a gift basket, maybe sprinkle in some Starbursts for his friend.
Well, I would agree with you. Kevin McCarthy would be number one, but you must admit, he really had close competition with Lindsey Graham. I mean, the question, Mark, I get asked most often as these days is, what the hell ever happened to Tucker Carlson? I know you were asked so often, what happened to Lindsey Graham? I'll ask you again. Yeah. I mean, how could you go from being John McCain's best friend to Donald Trump's best friend?
It's a great mystery. I asked him this explicitly, and he said, "Well, I just, anyone who knows me knows I want to be relevant. I want to be at the dice table." Meaning, if you don't want to be reelected, you're in the wrong business. So, I get that. It's crass, but it's what politicians do. But he takes it up so many notches. I mean, essentially, Lindsey Graham wants to be. He gets a real charge out of being in the mix. I mean, the idea that the president, and he can be seen golfing together is not only very powerful and very effective for him politically in South Carolina, but it's cool. It's like, at the end of the day, sometimes the only psychological explanation for these people is that they just think it's cool and they can't get enough of it. And the freebies and like the beautiful golf clubs and the pools and all the things. I mean, it becomes addictive, and it sounds kind of depressing because, these are supposedly our leaders. But that drives him a great deal. And here we are. So he loves being the senator who has the closest relationship to Donald Trump.
And as you point out, though, he's just one of this group. The phrase you use is were willing to discard every principle that they once held, right? So it's beyond being cool. It's really policies, principles don't matter, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, on one hand, I mean, they've gotten a lot of policy thing. I mean, like the judges. Let's just start with the judges. I mean, that is not a small thing, right? But you're right. But I mean, they discarded a lot. I mean, again, just part of it's just self-respect and pride. And like your best friend is John McCain. I mean, like he trashed him to the grave and beyond. I mean, and believe me, McCain, I learned there's a lot of this in the book that I didn't know before, but McCain was pissed. McCain and Lindsey at the end of McCain's life were not in a great place. And the last conversation I had with McCain before he died, he was like, where's everyone's self-respect? He wasn't talking explicitly about Lindsey. He was talking about his colleagues. And he said, I'd like to think that if I weren't, dying, actually, I would not be kissing his ass like this. I mean, it all comes down to self-respect. And, say what you will about John McCain. I mean, he had a very, he's a complicated character, but he had a lot of self-respect. And when you've lived the life that he has, I mean, how can you not sort of act with a measure of pride and self-respect? But I think he was disgusted. And, I think a lot of people were disgusted on John McCain's behalf at what Lindsey was willing to do, in sort of sidling up to Donald Trump.
Well, we don't have time to go into each one of every member of the pack.
We need a lot of time, Bill. Yeah.
I know, right. I want to ask you about one more, though, that I find intriguing. And that's Chris Christie. I mean, look, I read Christie's book. Donald Trump dumped on Chris Christie in every possible way. He wouldn't make him Attorney General. He wouldn't make him Secretary of State. even though Chris Christie, stood behind him in the campaign at all those news conferences, and Donald Trump made fun of him, called him fatso and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And then Chris Christie sticks with him. Then he breaks and he becomes this commentator on ABC. But as you point out, I'll let you tell it. In your last interview with him, you ask him, okay, are you done with Donald Trump? Would you ever vote for him? You would never vote for him again, would you? And Chris Christie, go ahead.
He said, that's a hypothetical. I won't answer it. I couldn't believe that. Thank you for identifying that, by the way, Bill. No one's picked up on that, but no, it was amazing. I mean, Christie is a man. I mean, the thing about Christie is he was, when he was governor of New Jersey, he just was like, hey, there are two ways to deal with a bully. You got to punch him in the face, or you can sidle up to him. And then apparently, the only person who, Chris Christie would sidle up to is not the tough guy from Jersey, but the sort of guy from with the dyed orange hair from Queens, right? The drama queen. So a bizarre character. I mean, I would hope that, again, it gets down to self-respect, but he's obviously worried about pissing off Trump even at this late date.
If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.